Towards the end of the Second World War, there were a number of executions carried out by the American army upon members of the German forces who had been captured. These were condemned to death for spying, and they were brought in front of a court-martial before they would be taken out to a firing squad who were there waiting with their rifles pointed high at their target. There were even some teenage German spies shot by the Americans to ruthlessly enforce that they would not accept anyone spying on their military movements. The Germans were equally as brutal when they dealt with captured Allied spies, and they would even throw some women accused of spying, in collusion with the French resistance, inside of a concentration camp's crematoria oven alive. Spying during the war was dangerous, and those people who were recruited for this were responsible for their fates, and the expectation was that they would not give anything over to their enemies if captured. But one man who was executed by firing squad towards the end of World War II, in fact in the final weeks of the conflict, was Richard Jarcyzk, and his execution was captured by photographers as the small man was sent out to the firing range before the rifles were pointed at him. But what did he do? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, the Germans were fighting a war on more than one front, and their forces were divided up, and they did suffer heavy losses. Especially after the Battle of Stalingrad, the German Wehrmacht forces became divided and splintered in their numbers, as many had become prisoners of war, and there were huge losses, and there were weaknesses in specific parts of the line. Because of this, the Germans actually recruited and forced many people from different occupied nations to join their fight, and to fight for them. There were many who did not want to fight for those people who were their enemies, and who were occupying their nations, but they were threatened to be sent to concentration camps if they did not, where they could meet their deaths inside of a gas chamber, or they were threatened with instant execution. There were many people who joined resistance groups, and these rightly were enraged that the enemy were recruiting civilians of their own to join their armed forces, and some were forced to do so. In Poland, following the German invasion that began World War II, there were 90,000 people who were forced to join the Wehrmacht upon threat of death, and these later had diverse roles in the Nazi war effort. One of those men who was forced to join up with the Germans and to carry out spy work upon the US forces was Richard Jarcyzk, the man who would later be executed. He was a member of the Volksgrenadier, and this division was created in autumn 1944 after Army Group Centre had fallen to the Soviets, as had the 5th Panzer Army, which had crumbled to the Allies in Normandy. The Volksgrenadier Regiment was founded to boost the morale of the German people, and those fighting for the Nazi cause, and in total 78 different divisions were formed, and these groups were mainly defensive, and they would try to stall advancing Allied and Soviet forces, and they were tasked to dig in where they could. Some units were given the latest weapons, such as the STG-44 gun, but most were given Panzerfaust, the one-time projectile weapon aimed to take out tanks and other vehicles. But the groups did contain experienced soldiers and battle-hardened veterans, but there was also anyone who could be drafted in to fight for them. There were younger children who were even brought into the fight eventually, and those who had previously been declared unfit for service in the Wehrmacht were desperately pressed into combat. It was Hitler's last roll of the dice, and he put pressure on people through propaganda to defend the Reich and to fight where they could. The Volksgrenadier fought on many different fronts and in different countries. They were seen on the battlefields of eastern France, trying to repel the Allies, who were attempting to liberate the country. They were also seen fighting during Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, and also during the Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's last roll of the dice, known as the Battle of the Bulge, to the Allies. They fought against the Soviet Red Army, and some soldiers were known to have been effective themselves, but on the whole the men were rushed to the front lines. They were wholly inexperienced, and they did have little training, leading to less effect on the battlefield. Richard Jarcyzk was fighting with the Volksgrenadier in the Rhineland region, and this would be taken by the US Army in March 1945. The Americans pushed hard to get into Germany, but there were undercover groups trying to disrupt them from within. They used spies of many ages to find out what they could about the US forces' movements and strengths, and this would then be fed back to the German High Command. There were lots of different people operating as spies for the Germans behind Allied lines, who would then pass information back. As mentioned earlier, there were teenagers who were later shot for this, and there was little mercy expressed to those who were spies. Richard Jarcyzk was not necessarily a young man. He appeared rather middle-aged, and he was a German soldier as a member of the Volksgrenadier, who was then tasked to work behind enemy lines, but his specific instructions were rather strange. He was not ordered to carry out normal spy work, but instead was ordered by the Germans to get rid of his uniform, and he was then told to wear civilian clothes and approach the US Army to work in a sense for them. His task was to aid the Americans to establish a local civilian government or council in the Rhineland region to keep things moving for the locals domestically, and the Americans were interested in Jarcyzk's proposal as it meant they could get the civilians on side through instilling a local government working for them. They thought this would be more tolerable for the Germans living in the Rhineland, but Jarcyzk was asked to spy on the US by the Germans. It was later claimed about him that, in the Rhineland, a Polish Volksdeutsch named Richard Jarcyzk infiltrated American lines, where he obtained civilian clothing from a sympathetic German woman, and in March 1945 got himself hired by an American military government detachment at Bruchweiler. Jarcyzk was such a conscientious employee that he was soon considered for an appointment as the burgomaster of a local town, although his suspicious behaviour eventually gave him away. It did not take long for Jarcyzk to become suspicious in the eyes of the US forces, but one of the key points later at his trial was that he was wearing civilian clothing, and with this was not considered any prisoner of war, but instead was to be considered as a spy of the German army. He was of course conducting espionage work, and at some point he was arrested for this, and he was then tried in front of the Americans rather swiftly. It was on the 6th of April 1945 that Richard Jarcyzk stood trial, and a significant amount of evidence was levelled against him, which led to him confessing that he had in fact been given top-secret training to conduct sabotage operations behind enemy lines. It was quite clear that he was guilty, and he was found to have been collating information about the local activity of the US forces, and this was then given to some local werewolf groups that would then conduct further attacks and raids against the Americans. With all this in mind, it did not take long for Richard Jarcyzk to be sentenced to death, being found guilty of being an enemy spy. He did not have to wait too long for his execution either, just a matter of weeks. It was on the 23rd of April 1945 that Richard Jarcyzk was taken out to the firing range, and he was taken by a military policeman towards a stake which had been placed in the ground. He walked freely towards this until his arms and legs were secured to the spot, and he was rendered immobile, and he could not escape. He looked rather smart for his execution, wearing a suit and his glasses as well as a large hat on his head. The Americans had also appointed a priest to be with him during his last few minutes, and this holy man gave him spiritual counsel. Whilst he was tied to the stake, the firing squad approached, and they took up position opposite Richard Jarcyzk, and they were some distance away. The commander in charge of the executioners told them to be ready, and they raised their rifles up towards the spy, and with this they were then given the order to fire, and their bullets crashed into the target, and Richard Jarcyzk was instantly killed. Richard Jarcyzk was one of a number of undercover spies who were shot in the final days of the Second World War for being involved in keeping tabs on American forces. The life of Richard Jarcyzk is not the most well documented, but his crimes during the Second World War against the Americans especially are, as is his fate. He was someone, let's remember, who may have been ordered to get involved in the Volksgrenadiers, and at the time those people who refused to fight were being hanged in the streets. His decision to spy may have been one which was not made completely from his free will. He may have been forced into doing it, but this is debated. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.